Welcome to the Comics Asylum podcast, where we explore the world of comic books, movies, television, and pop culture. My name is Steve Bino, and this week, Crystal Skillman and Fred Van Lente chat about their radio play podcast, King Kirby, adapted from their critically acclaimed Off-Broadway play based on the life of legendary comic book artist, Jack Kirby. So I'd like to welcome to the Asylum, Crystal Skillman and Fred Van Lente. Welcome. Pleasure to have you here both.
Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to be here, yes.
All right, excellent. So before we even start, how has 2021 been, and has it been anything different than 2020?
Ooh, what a great opening question.
Well, I mean, I know we're going to get into this, but like launching the podcast is something I've never done before. So that's been different, you know, coming in, talking folks like you on other podcasts and sort of doing all that has been quite an adventure. I definitely feel like I'm a professional comic book person. And at the beginning of 2020, as you may recall, everybody was freaked out about whether or not the comic book industry would actually survive. Right. But work really, okay, I have a cat butt in my face, and certain aspects of it are really interfering with my ability to answer the question. You go over there. Oh, whew. Where was I? Oh yeah, 2021. Up until 5 seconds ago, it was going great. No, I'm kidding. But work has really picked up, and actually 2020 has been pretty solid, I'd have to say. Here in New York City, we've gotten a lot of snow. In fact, today I think is the only, well, yesterday was finally we had the last snow. So we had this big blizzard on February 1st. And it's rare these days that we have snow a whole month, and that absolutely happened in February. So that was odd.
Yeah, it was super snowed in, and yeah, and I've been, for Crystal here, it's been, I have been transitioning to mediums and working in different mediums, like with writing for comics, and now starting for audio drama. I have a scripted series as well as King Kirby, and I'm starting to pitch for TV. But I've been like prepping for that for the past few years. So when the pandemic happened, it was just kind of like all of us, it was like a moment of like, where are you at? Like, what do you want? What are you going to do? So I've been really concentrating on that. But of course, I've been sad that, I am and have started as a playwright, and I'm the book writer of many musicals. But for the most part, for writers, it's so different because we have to be ready. We have to be ready when we come back. And so, and especially in musical theater, I'm the book writer of about 4 to 5 musicals in different stages.
Wow. And
I had no idea. One of them is Bobby Cronin, who did the music for King Kirby. He's amazing. But I had no idea how much my schedule was based on the fact that they were available at different times. And so when the pandemic hit, it was like, oh no, we're all available now, and we want to work because, we're trying to get through this. And I was like, wow, but I'm just one person. So, we just have been creating, and then to bring Bobby Cronin into this and working with us with King Kirby, it really has gotten us from 2020 to 2021. I feel now there is a bit of a difference because now we're really at the 1-year mark. And in fact, I'm having a play read on Wednesday that I had a huge reading of in New York. Just this March 6th.
It's the last, going to that reading in Manhattan was the last social thing I did before the pandemic hit.
Yeah. So I was kind of lucky that I had these couple, and another one was reading for these great producers who are working with us on Mary Max for my play Rain and Zoe, and they decided they wanted to option it. And that happened, that I remember we did that reading, it was privately, and now they're looking and talking to their UK component and designers and all this stuff. This is kept ongoing, but that was a year ago today. And I remember after we read, and I was so relieved it went well, and we were all having a great creative conversation, and someone got the notification on their phone and they said, Broadway's dark. And I'll just never forget. I just knew like it was, I mean, we had yet to hear about people that were sick to that extent and these kinds of things that we learned later. And some are not with us now, which is intense. But yeah, it was a year ago that everything changed.
And the thing that kind of struck me going through this whole year and how it's affected people health-wise and psychologically is how, I guess, we haven't really paid attention to the things that matter, and then what we've taken for granted. And so I'm even thinking of the industries that we're in, and comic books had its, I don't even know if it's fully out of it, but it had its kind of its its turning point in terms of pencils down, the distributors changing, all these kind of seismic shifts going on. But then you think of like live music and plays where you actually need an audience to have things go forward. How does that then impact not only the creative but also the industry as a whole?
It's huge. With audio drama is so different because, well, first of all, I'm really proud with how people are really remarking on their experience with it as a listener and how they feel like they can get into Kirby's head in that world. So that's really exciting because, I think it's cool that theater's using audio drama to share their work. Of course, I'm in that. But we really thought about this as a series. And like, if it is an audio drama, how is it a series? How does that work? What is that experience? As opposed to taking a play and making it a play experience. That's why it's in 4 parts and it works really well that way, which we're excited about. However, we can tweet, we can get on the phone with someone. It's different, and at the same time, this is a very, very bit nerdy, but Facebook and Twitter have changed their algorithms a little late, Twitter a little earlier, so that it's hard to share. So if you're an indie creator and you aren't, it's difficult. So we are getting a lot of traction. We are getting a lot of listenership, which is fantastic. But what I'm so used to in theater is lights go up and for good or bad, you see people. And that is just a different experience. And my showing on Wednesday, for instance, with a theater, I will get messages, I'll have a chat. People will call me after, but I won't have the experience of being in the room with them. And it's that's a live, there's something about the magic of live theater, and that's what it's about. It's the relationship between a live audience and live performers and a writer probably scared about what's going to happen.
No, for sure. So before we go ahead, can you tell our audience about King Kirby?
Sure. King Kirby was a stage production here in New York about the life of Jack Kirby, co-creator of the Marvel Universe and Captain America and New Gods, the sole creator of New Gods, Darkseid, all your favorites, and how and why he is lesser known today than maybe he should be. And we did it here in New York a few years back, and it's been done. There's been productions in Canada and the United States. The original production was crowdfunded through Kickstarter. And so as a Kickstarter bonus, we actually recorded an audio version of reading essentially in Midtown Comix downtown here in the city as a Kickstarter reward. Last year, someone approached us about doing an audio version of the play, and we realized, oh, wait, we have this recording of the cast doing it. Crystal recruited her pal, Bobby Cronin, the aforementioned composer, who did a great job sound editing and remastering and adding music to the production. But most of what you're hearing in the podcast is the original cast doing the show in a comic book store in 2014.
And I must admit, having it in Midtown, surrounded by a lot of Kirby's creations or the universes that he's helped to build or created on his own, must have been really satisfying.
It was neat. I mean, Midtown approached us. They wanted to do it for their podcast and did. It was really cool. And I read the scene directions, but when we did the audio drama version, I was like, well, let's cut me out. Let's make it as much as a radio play as we possibly could. And because the play moves around so much, I mean, it covers Kirby's life from the 30s to the 90s, him fighting in France, him dealing with the romance comics and growing up on the Lower East Side and everything else. It actually lent itself really well to this audio translation, which was fabulous.
And what were some of the challenges adapting it from a stage play to a radio play?
Well, in this case, we didn't know we were going to make into an audio drama series, but we're going from that original footage. It's kind of that great indie story, which is like, save the film, save the footage, save the sound. So we have this great piece, and it was really a pandemic project, and how we decided to use it.
I mean, I feel like the correct answer is we hired someone else to deal with that problem. And our wonderfully talented friend Bobby, who fortunately is a music teacher and keeps himself busy, but he admits was a little bored, during the lockdown. really put us all into it and really did a fantastic job of adding the soundscape. I mean, and using music in really creative ways and sound effects in really creative ways. You know, there's scenes set on spaceships, and there's scenes set in U.S. courthouses, and
you get into Kirby's head while he's drawing.
ruined hotels in France where Kirby's dealing with a German soldier he stumbles across.
Right.
But it all really invokes really well, and that's really a testament to Bobby's skill.
Yeah, and he wanted to edit it was a surprise, because I called him up about composing. There's an amazing superhero like theme to it. We wanted to capture Kirby's feeling. It's very rousing, and I just love it. But when we were talking to him, then he was like, "Oh, who's editing it?" And we were like really stressed. We were like, "Oh, we got to talk to editors." And he's like, "I'll do it." And we're like, "Really? Yeah, awesome."
And the one of the things that I found kind of interesting is, because it's set in the 30s when serials, like radio serials, were big, it kind of is a perfect marriage to the time. Even the actor that is Kirby, like, I feel like I'm like a little kid again listening to those serials. It really is a nice fit.
Yeah, my dad had records of the Orson Welles doing The Shadow, like those old shows from the early 40s, and I guess the late 30s. And Stephen Ratazi, who plays Kirby, is perhaps most famous to geek audiences as he played Dr. Orpheus on the Venture Brothers.
Right. Good, so, great show.
Yeah, he's a very experienced voice actor, and again, he played Kirby on the stage. None of us had any inkling would go in this direction as a podcast.
Right.
Even when we recorded it as a podcast, it's strange to say, but true.
And so.
And the episodic nature of it, that was cool to discover too, that worked.
Yeah, for sure. Because like split into 4, you have a 4-issue miniseries when you kind of think of it.
Right. Sure.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so what was your biggest surprise delving into Kirby's past and then also his accomplishments?
Well, I had been fascinated by it for years. A lot of this play came out of a biography I was working on and then abandoned. But I guess the strain with Kirby is always he had this kind of like, he was weirdly sort of angry a lot and kind of this scrappy guy. He was literally a street gang member. Like he would get into street fights and the Irish gangs would fight his Jewish gangs and stuff like that. Or it was really, I mean, we make it sound ethnic, but really it's just they lived on another block. You know what I mean? That was their big, horrible transgression, right? That all these gangs were fighting over. But yet at the same time, he very rarely, when it came to Stan Lee kind of being the public face of Marvel and insinuating that he created all of it for the most part, and Kirby was just the craftsperson, the sidekick, if you will, trying to come up with it all. Kirby was sort of weirdly passive until the very end there, and for decades, he just kind of shrugged his shoulders and plowed forward. And I think that's a lot of that. And so what I sort of discovered was, and it's something, I mean, we're talking about stuff that maybe you haven't heard yet because it's on the 4th episode, but so sorry, spoilers, Steve. Spoilers. I apologize. but he, I think it was in many ways, I mean, I was saying with this, it's called King Kirby, right? Like all the great dramas like Shakespeare and the Greeks and everything else. It's like, we're not interested in victims, right? We're interested in how people are the architects of their own destruction. And I think in Kirby's case, it was his ability to sort of walk away from Marvel and then do New Gods and then walk away from that was always born of this sort of arrogance of genius, because he always thought he could just create his way out of any problem. He'd done he'd done Captain America, he'd done Boy Commandos, he'd done Young Romance, he'd done Fantastic Four and Thor. And he just figured that the train would keep rolling, and it probably didn't occur to him. He just didn't know what to do with a guy like Stan, who was extremely charismatic in a way that he wasn't. And really, the minute I think Stan saw he had something going here with Marvel, kind of wrapped his arms around it and didn't let it go. And I don't think Kirby was sort of surprised by that.
And much of that was fleshed out in the play. It was a bit different in that it showed Kirby creating things on stage, but they were illusions, or it was making the comparison to actual Marvel characters. So it added extra layers. So my take on it when I was just giving notes, wasn't co-writing, and then Fred was like, "You're co-writing it," was to really ground it in following the work and staying with the people, and then through that we are learning about the creations, and that way we could actually refer to the actual creations because we're not actually depicting them on stage, which was evocative. And then I think I learned a lot about Razs, which I just was really moved by. I found this little detail of, that she used to ink and help
Kirby's wife.
Kirby's wife, Roz Kirby, who's an incredible character in person and human. And so, although I never met her, I heard these incredible stories. And so that dynamic I was excited to explore with Fred. And then we really, I brought to the table that we have to see this confrontation between Stan and Kirby. And so that's what drama is made of when something in real life didn't happen. It's actually, I think, the sign that you should take something from real life and do it. What's the most boring is something else you could Google or discover. And okay, I'm seeing it played out in front of me. So when we came up with what you're about to hear in episode 4, it took some work, but I think it's one of my favorite scenes I've ever worked on. And it was really nicely 50-50, I think, between the two of us. And
absolutely.
So listen to episode 4 because you might hear that what you're excited to hear between Stan and Kirby.
Well, Andy, you know how it ends.
Yeah, I have a question, but I'm gonna flip to something that I remember listening to a long time ago, and it was a radio interview, and I don't know if both of you are familiar with this, but Stan was talking to somebody, and then Jack called in.
Yes,
it was amazing. It's a
yeah.
great interview. If anyone can find it on YouTube or wherever it is, I suggest that they listen to it. But it was amazing how Stan had his interpretation, how things played out. And Jack's like, I don't think it went down that way. And he was very gentlemanly in his disagreeing with Stan.
Right.
And so you can see how when you're mentioning that he just walked away because, I can create something else, that was kind of not the combative nature that he had maybe when he was younger. Right.
Well, I don't know if I'd ever thought about it this way, and I was just sort of sitting here thinking about it. I think that fundamentally Jack just underestimated Stan. Like, I think it was tough for Jack to comprehend that people wouldn't see through Stan, because to Jack, Stan was transparently a really upwardly mobile. There's this novel from the 60s or the 50s that he always references called What Makes Sammy Run. There's this character. Mm-hmm. I don't know very much about it myself, but Kirby would always describe Stanley like this character Sammy Glick, who's this very kind of like just kind of very charismatic, but kind of like almost like kind of a used car salesman, right? Kind of stereotypical, kind of like, hey, how you doing? Oh, Steve-O, great to see you, Steve Man. Mm-hmm. And I will say that doing this project and doing my comics at the Comic History of Comics, and just having worked at Marvel for so long and knowing so many people who knew Stan Lee. I mean, the people who most vociferously who support Stan Lee and kind of either are very frustrated by Kirby's not going along with the company line, or Kirby saying that he basically created the whole thing himself. These are people who knew Stan and worked with Stan personally, and they're very and this is across like age groups, right?
They're loyal.
Stan really, I guess, had that charisma. I never met him myself, but he clearly had this charisma where people really saw him as kind of like a father figure. I'm also doing a book about the history of animation, and Walt Disney had a very similar affect. He had a very kind of like fatherly, kind of like paternal kind of vibe, and that repelled a lot of people. I mean, Walt Disney made a lot of enemies. Stan Lee drove away Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Wally Wood, some of the greatest comics creators of all time. Marvel could have had Orion and Darkseid along with Captain America and Thor and Iron Man if Stan and the American comic industry could learn how to share credit a little bit better. But yeah, I mean, Stan I just feel like Kirby really saw Stan as that punk kid playing his flute in the timely offices in the 40s, as you hear in episode 2 of our show.
Yeah, that's pretty funny.
Yeah, and I just think that it's like that classic, you never get a second chance to make your first impression. That was Kirby's first impression of Stan, and he never really lost. I just think he just couldn't believe that this guy had put one over on him so, firmly and completely.
And Crystal, considering that Kirby already had a working relationship with Joe Simon. And he was also kind of like, my name first, your name first, and, the whole thing about the suits. I don't want to give away too much, right? Do you think that also played a role, as well as Stan being younger, to how deferential he was, or not as, combative as he could have been?
Yeah, well, Fred's written about this with many creative people, and we were talking about it with tech too, with Steve Jobs and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a pattern. It is a pattern where someone, Kirby's clearly an artist who wanted to work and to make and imagine, and this kind of fight is not fun. This kind of trying to sell it, trying to then combat these things when you clearly think people will see through it. And you have a relationship with someone. But yeah, I think that these teams tend to work in this way. And you saw and heard and know like how much he would draw, and to do that, it takes an immense. I think he preferred fantasy to reality, and I think that's what I relate to. So a lot of my work beyond this, and I think Fred's work too, is about that. I mean, I think Fred and I are actually like that. Like we have to do some of this nuts and bolts stuff, but we certainly don't enjoy it. And every time I meet a writer friend who loves doing that stuff, I'm like, oh, you love spreadsheets and you love getting ready for your pitches, and you love, not that I don't love those things, but there's an act of creation where you get swept away. And that honestly is really the reason why, I do it as an artist. So, it's nice to have somebody say, hey, I'll take care of that. Don't worry about that. But that does have repercussions further down the line. And I think there's a line in the play that's, comics, they were supposed to be temporary. You can completely understand this thing didn't exist before. And it's, we're in this place where we're being listened to and people are reading and following these characters. I think the idea that they could become possibly, money that you could live on for the rest of your life. I think it was all beyond what Kirby could understand. And that I think is why audiences that are new to comic book history are fascinated by, because they relate to Kirby right away. Because they're like, that's like my dad. That's like me. That's like my sister. We're all trying to figure out our budgets and to like do what we love and our passion, yet put food on the table. And they've never seen that kind of story with someone who, it's hard for them to imagine someone that could create the bigness of Captain America. Yeah, he's got to make money for his kids and his family. And so they're very moved by that story.
And being artists, you'll connect to this, the way that I guess episode 1 opens at the auction, and it's like that one piece of artwork probably was a decade's worth of his salary, right? Like when you factor in cost of living and everything going up, what it's selling for and the fame.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's funny is that, that auction is a real auction I got out of the Kirby Collector magazine, and those pieces that the auctioneer's talking about, those were all like later in life reproductions, right? Like, so those weren't even the originals, and they were going for $1,000. You can't even imagine, if they were indeed from the 60s originals, how by factor 10, 20, 30 or whatever, how much money they'd be going for. I mean, it's staggering.
Yeah. It's kind of like it's a little bit different now, but especially when you go back in the past, what an artist gets, it's usually after they've passed on, right? So whether it's the fame or the cash, it seems to follow them into the grave. But when they're actually working, and the thing about Kirby was like, it was almost like his work ethic, talent, speed, all those things were like all superpowers, and he was able to put them together to like, yeah, I'm gonna draw your universe for you. You need 30 pages. I'm going to grind out those 30 pages. Right. It wasn't a case of like, oh, stuff's lost in FedEx and yeah, I'll get that to you, and books delayed. He was hitting his deadlines. Right.
Yeah. You'd have, in those days, he lived in Long Island, and you did get on a train, and go into New York City and they wouldn't trust that to the mails,
Right.
Yeah. I mean, this is totally unrelated to Kirby, but one of my favorite stories about the making of Watchmen was that because there was no like FedEx, like Alan Moore would have to call a cab and put the manuscript for the next issue of Washington in the cab, and the cab driver would drive to Dave Gibbons' house, and Dave Gibbons had to pay him, and then get the manuscript, and that's how they sent the.
That's an amazing
the
story.
script back and
That's
forth.
a great story.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
There's a lot of faith there, to be honest with you.
Right. Well,
And taxi cab driver.
an English cab driver probably had no clue what he was. You know, in 1984 or whatever it was, he was driving. He's like, all right, this weird bearded guy is handing me, this manuscript and gave me an address. All right,
and
pile of paper.
And getting back to the Kirby's home life, to Jack's home life, you two being creators and are working on things, and Roz's importance in his life. The thing that struck me was when he came back from the war, her first thing to say to him, right?
Yeah.
Just to make sure that your drawing hand isn't injured.
Yep.
I thought that was absolutely fantastic.
Quote.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's definitely a case of reality being a good writer.
My dad loved that too. Like that's the first he texted me. He's like, I love that ending. I love that line.
And considering all, raising 4 kids together and then going through, the war and hard times in the industry going up and down, having that kind of support makes it a lot easier to then be creative as well too.
Yeah.
I think so. I think that's the greatest gift, is someone who can see what you do and who sees you through what you can do in yourself. And they really had that relationship.
Razs obviously was a force to be reckoned with. And just to do a plug, Rob Salkowitz of Forbes, who was kind enough to do we have a 5th episode actually coming after the 4th one, which is a roundtable between me and Crystal and the cast and Bobby. And Rob has I'm not going to spoil it. It's a great Roz Kirby story that he met her at San Diego Comic-Con, and everyone who listens to this will get a kick out of it. It's a
great story. It's awesome.
Oh, I can't wait for it. I was speaking to another artist about how comic books is kind of like the biggest undercover fame you can have. Like hundreds of thousands of people can know you and can follow your work, and yet they don't know what you look like. You can go to the supermarket, and
right.
Then by extension, what your family has to endure because of the long hours, sitting
Sure.
at a table, drawing or coming up with the ideas and plotting. It's really a grind, and the faith in the industry as well as yourself has to be quite enormous for you to keep plugging away.
Yeah.
Yeah, you really have to have understanding. I think with writers in general, you have to people that are understanding. Like if you're in the zone, you have to leave someone in the zone and all that. But comics, yeah, for writers, for sure it's there. But I would say absolutely with Kirby and being an artist, that the time at the drawing board is extenuous, and we, with our friends today, like, what I mean? Like there's this mini comic I always think of that gosh, I wish I kept it. But it was as a comic book artist, and you follow him from when he's very young, and he's like, gotta make comics. He's just drawing comics. And she's like, his wife is like, will you marry me? She's like, yeah, gotta make comics. You have a kid. Like, Daddy, will you come out and play with me? Yeah. As soon as I finish this comic, gotta make comics. And then there's like a grave, and it's like, oh, Daddy had to make comics. And then it follows that aliens have bought his mini comic, and they're like, this is so great. We can use these staples to buy things for us.
You have to say the line. You have to say the line.
Crass.
These aliens come down and they find buried in his grave.
You should let me say the line.
These mini comics that were buried with the guy, and they throw the comics away, and they just have the metal staples. Because metal is valuable in the far future.
This is terrific. We can use this to buy pussy on Mars. Yes, I know that's crass for some viewers, but it's very gangster brothers humor there.
We can use staples to buy pussy on Mars. It's a big catchphrase in our household. But it sums up the challenge of the creative person.
Yeah.
That's what your work will be.
Hopefully, it's
for.
More than that, but it's a good laugh. I love the days of just reading mini comics. We used to have so many.
Or it's like in England, like, can you imagine how the Celts or the Picts or whatever spent all that time raising all these like Stonehenge like menhirs and stuff, these giant standing stones, but then people would just drag them and put them in their houses. Like, fuck it. I don't have any, I don't want to, like, why should I go to the quarry like a jerk when they have these giant stones just sitting right here in my house? Let's just get some ropes and drag them over.
There's that amazing New Yorker cover we always think of. Gosh, wasn't that close? Like, who drew that? A father and a daughter.
It's Adrian Toma.
Adrian Toma, yes. It's so gorgeous, and he is walking with his daughter, and he sees one of his books, or comics, or illustrated.
It's a book.
It's a book, and it's on the, it's like that Brooklyn thing where it's up against a gate, like just take it for free. Like
take a book, leave a book, take a book.
Is the shot is from like a basement apartment, right? And the father and daughter just walking along the sidewalk, and the daughter's getting all excited and pointing at a book. On her side, she's seeing the front cover, right? But because we're on the other side of the bars, we only see his grinning about the author cover, and the actual dad is just pissed off that somebody left his book out on the street.
Right. Yeah. It's part of being the artist, right?
Exactly.
So
yes.
It's out. It has to come out. It has to get out of you. It has to be in the universe, and then after that, all bets are off.
That's right.
It's true. It belongs to something greater than you at that point, and it comes back to you.
Mostly the staples, though. Staples are what will matter in the future. If you're saddle stitched, you're shit out of luck.
Specifically,
yeah, then you're done. Totally done. So I want to kind of go back to the business of comics, because you touched on it earlier that it was a complete roller coaster, right? With the paper shortages, people wanting to change what was in the book, the comics code coming around. It almost seems as though it was a business with no business plan. And it was kind of like, hey, it's sunny today, we're going to do books about sun. And then it's cloudy tomorrow, we're going to do cloudy books. It was amazing how on a dime they would switch. Yeah,
particularly Marvel. Like we Marvel was absolutely sort of the Hydrox to the rest of the comic book industry's Oreos. It was the cheap knockoff. Like if people were making Western books, they would do Western books. When the Korean War started, suddenly war comics were big. So they started cranking out a million war comics. They were the biggest. When Simon and Kirby invented romance comics, Timely, aka Marvel, were the biggest publishers of romance comics in the country. They just cranked them out like the bushel full. Millie the Model, when Archie was big. So Patsy, I love this, is Patsy Walker, who those of you who watch Jessica Jones may recall as a character in that show. She was the Archie ripoff. Patsy Walker in the 50s was a ripoff of Archie, just with the genders reversed. So Patsy Walker was a redhead like Archie was, and Al Jaffe of Mad Fulton fame was one of the artists at Marvel at the time, and he said that Stan Lee made him go in and like add that Archie has these sort of very like almost
those,
like
the cross hatches.
Yeah, exactly. The cross hatches. So Patsy had cross hatches as well. So so Marvel was very much known for, knocking off other people's books. So it makes sense that so there's a very famous story that Lee talks about in Origin Marvel Comics that we do in the show, which is the was it Martin Goodman, Stan's cousin-in-law and the boss, the owner of the company, went golfing with the head of DC Comics, who talked about how great their superhero books were doing again after superheroes after the war kind of completely fell out of favor. But then the so-called Silver Age started, right, with the Barry Allen Flash and the Hal Jordan Green Lantern and all that stuff, and then they did Justice League of America, and so Leibowitz told Stan time to do more superhero books. And at that point, the Kirby and Stan Lee stories totally diverge because they tell totally different stories.
Which we get into in the fourth.
Which we get into to a certain degree in the fourth. And we didn't. Kirby in the 80s told the story about walking into Marvel one day and having the furniture being taken out, and Stan sort of sitting there sobbing inconsolate, and Kirby shows up and says, "I'm going to do this book called The Fantastic Four." That story is dubious in a number of different levels. Not the least of which is that apparently, like by that point, Marvel was basically Stan and the production people and a secretary. So taking the furniture of Marvel in 1959 would have taken about 20 minutes. So it's kind of like, so if Kirby like showed up, like it was just this amazingly lucky window when he showed up just before all the furniture was taken off. But I think that Kirby was sort of seeing how Stan liked to sort of tell stories and embellish the truth. And he was sort of like, well, I'm going to start telling stories. Apparently that's the only way to get people to believe you, This whole being honest stuff is for the birds, can blame them at that point, you know?
And isn't it kind of just like our society anyway, where, you know, you look at politics, you look at entertainment, you look at, you know, sports, we always want that one superstar to kind of bring us along, right? But it's really some of the soldiers or the second in command or the 1A that's just as important. But people just don't want to buy what's being sold if it's coming out of a certain vessel.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like we're pack animals and we're looking for the alpha. I just think we don't like nuance, and it's just easier to think. You know, you'd be shocked, I guess. Like I said in this animation book, you'd be shocked to see how many like intelligent people. Like I remember, like I uncovered a review by John Updike of all people, like the novelist, and he talked like Walt Disney through every frame of those movies himself, and it's like, you know what you're fucking talking about? Like, you know, I mean, it's just stunning how people have zero interest where their culture and their entertainment comes from, really, you know, when it comes right down to it. How the sausage is made, they have, you know, no interest in it as long as it tastes good, you know?
Yeah, it reminds me of that line from The Matrix where, you know, he's made a deal with the robots, the machines, and he's like, I know the steak isn't real, but I'm going to enjoy eating it. I've butchered the line, but that's basically it.
Right. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's such a meta world in life that we've been living for a while, and now it's completely gone high octane in a way. I also know that, you know, and journalists have to face this as well. I mean, for what we have of journalism now, which is changing all the time, and journalists have to fight for their lives at this point, real journalism, but literally. This in telling a big story, you've got to focus on the one person. You've got to give that narrative if you really want the story to get across, because it's just part of human nature. You know, we want that hero's journey in some way. And we're looking for it. And it's great right now that we're challenging that. And we're talking about that with a lot of new TV stuff coming out, and just how we can follow different characters. And it's happening at Comix. But at that time, you know, with this kind of story and this kind of success story, it's also that Stan became a celebrity, and we live in, and Stan is really a part of that, you know, and I think Abraham Reisman gets into it in his book, True Believer. You know, it's celebrity culture, you know. We're so happy this is doing so well, but we're also really proud that these actors are wonderful and they have their followings. But, you know, this wasn't about, okay, great, let's go get, you know, who's the most famous person, Fred, that you'd like to write an audio podcast for?
You mean as a subject or as an actor?
No, as an actor.
I don't know anyone. Tom Hanks.
We weren't like, okay, now we can put Tom Hanks and, you know, and, you know, like to talk about some of the suits, they're kind of looking at that, you know, that kind of model, you know, like let's get an idea and then let's, you know, and I think there was a New York Times article about it recently. And I actually love hearing celebrities talk about it, because they're like, this pandemic happened, but you know, these audio dramas, I get to do them from my house. And then like, it's like amazing. Like, I don't even, you know, like they're just like so excited, you know. But, you know, this is an art form, and it's exciting to see people play with this much. And I think I've talked about it a bit before in other places, but indie theater and drama also plays extremely well in the audio sphere, because we didn't have much of a budget to begin with. So we had to imagine big, and it was like a black box. We had to be imaginative, and that plays extremely well on audio.
I think it was literally a black box.
We were literally the black box, yes.
It was the theater was called The Brick, and it had like brick walls. So I guess it was a red box. If you want to be specific about it, but you know, it's
one of my favorite black boxes, I have to say.
It's clearly an old garage.
Yeah, I love black box theaters. Yeah.
So considering the Marvel method, right, and the great stuff that's come out of it, but also I guess on the creative end when it comes to you know, giving proper credit to the creators, how has that impacted how you guys go about, you know, doing your craft?
Well, I mean, the Marvel method is not used and I that much these days. Like Mark Waid and Dan Slaughter are the only guys I know that still do it. I hope no one I work for is listening to this podcast, because if I'm doing the Marvel method, you know, I have checked out of the project. Like I have like But again, you know, and I feel like I can't stress this enough. What modern creators do and have done, even really since the mid 60s, called the Marvel method, is completely different than what Stan did. What Stan did is he called you up and said, let's have him go fight God, or let's have this issue's villain be the Kingpin, or whatever it is. Not always. Sometimes there'd be stereo conferences. Sometimes he'd be driving back and forth between Long Island and New York with an artist. Particularly, I remember John Romita Sr. was somebody used to do this with a lot. But in other words, what Stan was doing was not, at least in that phase of the project, not really what anybody would really consider writing. You know, that would be more of his giving editorial direction. So, I mean, Marvel's a very editorially driven, you know, company. Like when I was working there, they would call you up and they say, we want Deadpool to fight Punisher. And you'd be like, okay. It's not like I'd be like, I got a great idea. Deadpool should fight Punisher. Like, no. That was not our job. It was their job to come and tell us, you know, that sort of stuff. So just from a pure Marvel standpoint, also when I was at Marvel, and I'm pretty sure this is still the case, editors weren't allowed to write. Like that was a ban. So they clearly, you know, this whole Stan Lee situation caused enough problems. They changed company policies that would never happen again.
Right.
You know, so.
Do you think some of the not using the Marvel method also had to do with, at the time that like Kirby and Ditko were talking about not getting their fair share?
Right. And, you know, let's bring it down to an even sort of more basic level, right? As we keep talking about credit, what we're also not talking about is money, because Stan was pocketing the page rate for writing when really it was the artist that was largely Wally Wood's problem when he was doing Daredevil, and why he quit Daredevil so quickly was because he realized he was doing 80% of the writing and getting 0% of the page rate for writing.
Right.
And a lot of artists have wised up and they're like, if you're going to make me, so that's why most Marvel style plots, so-called Marvel style plots, are 5, 6, 7 pages long. I mean, the only couple plots we've found of Stan are 2 pages long, which is barely, you know, a suggestion. You know, so, I mean, I worked directly with Dan, and on Amazing Spider-Man, I dialogued a couple of his plots. His plots are 5, 6, 7, 8 pages long. Like they actually tell you what to do. And I've had a lot of artists, frankly, are annoyed at being asked to write when they're not being paid for it, A, and B, when they have enough problems trying to figure out just what to draw, how to draw what they're being asked to draw. Some guys, Riley Brown, our buddy, friend of the show, great artist. He loves Marvel style. Dennis Calero loves Marvel style. Like I've worked with some artists who specifically request Marvel style, but I've worked with more artists who specifically refuse to do Marvel style.
And some of the great little details of this, if you're interested in writing for comics, Make Comics Like the Pros is a book I use when I teach. Fred and Greg Pak wrote it, and they use a Riley Brown scenario and showing that how it got. It was Fred's scenario, and then Riley Brown draws it. However, it asks you to figure it out first. It has some cool exercises in there, but it takes you from writing to publication, you know, all of it, you know, to the art and collaboration. It's a wonderful book, but it does also detail these differences in style and script making. So it's pretty cool.
And I can imagine that the process is a lot easier when there is like a relationship between the two creators, right? When you have an established relationship, whether you're friends or you've worked together before and you kind of get each other's sensibilities, it then makes things a little bit easier in terms of like what you want then communicated not only as a writer, but then what is then translated as the artist.
Well, and it, you know, it just related directly back to Stan and Jack. Don't forget Stan was Jack's boss. Like he decided who got hired and fired. I don't have the power. If I work with an artist, we are equals in terms of our ability to, you know, get each other fired. You know what I mean? Like That was absolutely not the case. If an artist has a problem with something I'm doing, he can go to the editor and, you know, complain or try and work something out. Jack had no recourse. He just had to smile and take it because it, you know, his collaborator was his, you know, the person who decided whether he got work or not.
Yeah.
And friendship sort of implies, you know, equality, right? You know, like it's hard to be friends with somebody who is like up here in terms of status above you, you know.
And I wonder if that power dynamic also then contributed to Jack maybe not pushing back as hard.
I think that's 100% correct. I think you've hit the nail on the head. And when he came back to Marvel in the 70s after going to DC, and where he created the Eternals and Machine Man and a bunch of other characters, he insisted on being his own editor. He wouldn't come back unless he got to write, draw, and got left alone. So we wised up in his next go around on Marvel. Stan was gone by then, so it wasn't necessarily a problem. But
right.
But he knew where the power lay.
Where he was excited though was that Stan was so liberal in the sense of like, yeah, you want to create stuff, like let's talk about, like you want to bring me your ideas. And
but that bit him on the ass in the end,
bit him on the ass. But Jack was excited by somebody who would listen to things that maybe other people thought, oh well, that's a little too out there, or and so he, I think, got excited by having that ear. But ultimately, we see this happen a lot in every collaboration where it's in the beginning, they have a little bit more of a front relationship because he actually meets Stan when he's younger, kind of as an assistant, and kind of forms this thought, this judgment of him, which I think Stan might have always felt, or we insinuate that in the play. But, in a lot of collaborations, you start out and you're working together, and it isn't until at some point you realize I'm doing most of the work, or we don't see it the same way, even though we see the story the same way, but we don't see our deliberate. And it's messy to try to untangle if you didn't know in the beginning, or at least say, hey, if you end up co-writing the story with me, we're going to talk about that, or have an open door. It's very hard to bring up. It's very hard. This is kind of, this whole play relationship was the first time we wrote together, but it was odd in that I was just giving thoughts on the play. Like I really just thought I'll keep reading drafts and talking about it. It was Fred that like slapped my name on it. So that never happens. And so
congratulations.
Thank you, honey.
I'm here for you, sweetie. It was nothing.
And because I've done collaborations as well too. And even though you're laser focused on where you want it to go, it might be a difference of style, right? And that sometimes can be the biggest, obstacle in the road. So then when you were working on this together, were there any kind of moments where it was like, well, I think we should go this way? And then how do you then, is it a coin flip? Is it let's get back to this in 2 weeks kind of thing? How do you then solve your disagreements, if you had any?
Mud wrestling. No. I wish. No, then I'd lose every single time. But
yeah, you would.
Well, so I had already written a draft like 12 years or something before we picked it up again. So initially, Crystal was sort of working with 10-year-old Fred, and modern Fred didn't give a shit what 10-year-old Fred, 10-year-older, I said, I didn't write the play, but it's 10 years old. I meant
Prodigy.
In the past. In the past.
It's like Happy Riverdale.
10 years younger, I should say. Like, I didn't give a shit what that guy thought. So she could do whatever she wanted to her, to that word. So that helped because you were collaborating with essentially a person who no longer existed. So always reduces arguments.
Although we're co-writing something together now, and you're doing the first.
Well, yeah, and we fight constantly.
Well, what's great about us? We usually see the story. We break story together, and it's fun. I always feel like when we talk about what a writer's room does, I think it's so terrific. But on a smaller way, that's what collaborators really are doing. They're doing that for each other, maybe in a 2-person team or 3, maybe 1. That gets a little nutty because you're bouncing things off by yourself. Mm-hmm. But in the what's awesome is that we have different takes on the scene, and when Fred wants to kind of race through something, I'm kind of like, but what are the beats and how do we get there? And then when I'm like, oh man, but I can't wait to get to this twist, Fred's also like that. Or it's if I'm spending too much time and it's not moving things forward, Fred's really great about that. So we kind of complement each other in that way. And a lot of our arguments actually ended up in the play. The Razs and Jack have a few moments, and I had this monologue I was just really excited about. Kareem Fahmy is a director I'm working with right now on another play thing, and he, this is the thing, I overwrite a bit, and each draft I do is just my thing, and so I get a lot of but this original monologue, to be fair to Fred, was which is Raz's in the last episode, is really beautiful. It was originally like, I don't know, like 2 minutes long. It was like a whole page. And
it was the whole show.
And Fred was like, I'm cutting it out. And I was like, if you cut it out, this relationship is over. And I was just like, and we just were fighting. And they're like, oh, they're fighting. Oh, it's like this. Oh, let's put this dialogue in the play. So then we just, it helped us edit the monologue, but also give over to the scene. And it's one of the best scenes in there. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. And, you know, it was interesting when we batted back and forth the Stan and Kirby scene that you'll see, because I think sometimes we flip. Sometimes I was Kirby-ish and sometimes you were Stan Lee. But you really, Fred has always had this something about how Stan, I mean, your dialogue is always great. And for Kirby, it's great. But you really crystallize Stan's philosophy in ways that are surprising that you'll hear in the 4th episode, but totally ring true.
I mean, the most important, I think, quality for any writer to have is empathy, you know, being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And so that's why I just think that, you know, I think a lot of people, when they hear it's a Kirby play, they see it and they're like, oh, you treated Stan really nicely. Like, they just assume, like, I've met some like Kirby fans who just want to dig up Stan's corpse and beat it up with sticks, you know, like, and I'm just like, I'm not about that. Like, I'm not interested in doing that. You know what I mean? Because one thing, if Stan is that bad, then it sort of reduces, to me, you know, Kirby's agency and, you know, how he put himself in his own position. So, yeah.
And I'm really interested in unpacking, and we're still having these conversations. Like one listener wrote somewhere on social media, "This is so great," and Fred had just written an article for 13th Dimension. It was actually a review of Abe's book, Abraham Rison's book, True Believer, and talking about how he came to kind of realize Stan wasn't exactly who he said he was in terms of credit creation. But someone posted on social media, like, this is so fascinating. I agree. I'm not going to tell my daughter yet. You know, and my mom actually took a little bit. I think she gets it now, but, you know, Stan had such a public persona. And one of the most complex things about the truth is you can hold two things in your hands at the same time. And so Stan gave you something and he made you feel like he was a part of your life. But it was the more I came at understanding the story through this play, really, and through Fred, and also Fred deals with this through line very thoroughly as well in Comic Book History of Comics with Ryan Dunleavy, who drew that artwork. You know, there's this real dawning that, you know, it's just very hard when someone's like, I love the mutants because I feel like, that I don't belong, and he wrote these diverse characters, and I feel like this, and you know, and so much of this didn't come from him. That's difficult because you know they don't really want to hear that story. Like they just want to be like, no, Stan, like because they just heard his voice talking to them, and they associate him with a time in their life when they were a teenager, and this got them, these X-Men storylines, you know, got them through it. So,
and when you think about it, Stan was in all the cartoons, right? So you're talking about fans of the Marvel Universe or comic books or entertainment as a whole, which would have, you know, had Stan ringing in their ears when they were 5 or 6 years old. And then you go, you know, 4 or 5 decades later, it's kind of hard to kind of separate what you grew up believing as a true believer versus reality, right? Like they always say, don't meet your heroes. And I've been lucky enough that, you know, that hasn't rung true. A lot of the people that I've met have been actually been quite nice. And it's not always the case though, right?
Well, Fred, you ride the elevator with Stan Lee.
I did. That was the closest I came to meeting. Yeah, you're totally right. I mean, and also it comes to that, you know, don't forget, I think Disney was largely Lee's role model in this because Disney hosted the Wild World of Disney on ABC for decades. And so, you know, it's sort of very similar where Disney was a producer, you know, he'd like approve films and stuff, but he wasn't writing or directing or voice acting or drawing or character design or anything else. But yeah, there becomes sort of this knee jerk. I think also it's probably a product of the last 5-6 years where people get very defensive. They'll think that, you know, everything's being, you know, torn down and all of our old, you know, it's an old guy, you know, what are you doing? Leave him alone. And I think there's a lot of knee-jerk reaction against that. But I think in this particular instance, it's a little more warranted. I mean, again, people like, because we did the play and stuff, is I'm sort of known as being like a pro Jack guy. And I find it a little frustrating because I feel like people just don't want to believe that you can be a pro truth guy. You know, like, I just want to know what happened. Like, I don't actually.
It's not judgmental.
Yeah, I mean, the lack of evidence. Like I said, I don't believe in Kirby's story of walking into Marvel when they're taking the furniture out. The lack of evidence doesn't support either side, but there's this kind of knee-jerk, like, it's the desire to, you've heard the story so many times that becomes its own evidence. You know what I mean? Like the fact that the legend is, it's like, the George Washington cut down the cherry tree story that came out like years after he died. Like it was in one of the first biographies about George Washington, but still, it's just the kind of thing people have always heard, so they always assume it's going to be true,
And it fits a narrative, right? And sometimes, we go with the story as opposed to reality.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I've had a great time chatting. Before we go, 2 questions. What can we look forward to? I know you've mentioned it a little bit, but what can we look forward either as a collaboration between the two of you or separately from either of you coming up?
Well, we have a comic book called Eat Fighter, which is on Webtoon that we've co-written.
Webcomic.
Yeah, a webcomic. We're in a new collection of Adventure Time, so which is pretty great. The one that focuses on Princess Bubblegum. So that just came out for Boom. And we're very excited about Wednesday, March 3rd. I have a reading at night, but also the 4th episode of Kirby drops, which we're really, really excited about. And also that leads nicely to Fred and what he's working on.
That's right. I'm with Ryan Dudley doing the comic book History of Animation from IDW, and the 4th episode or issue drops on March 3rd. So you can just have a Fred and Crystal potpourri on March 3rd. Of listen to the podcast, read the comic, watch the reading. Oh my gosh, it's amazing.
The play is at it's called Playwright Center, Central Time, 7 o'clock Central Time, 8 p.m. Eastern. You can work out Pacific. It's a play called Pulp Verte. That's and you can also check out online. There's a lot about Mary Max the musical, which is Project Bobby Cronin, the composer of King Kirby, and I work on.
And I guess I should point out that I'm also doing the zombie superhero. Steve is a lucrative side project effort of mine, and I'm doing the Dynamite zombie crossover. Nomite. We just concluded our first season. The second season, which is called Dynamite Lives! ! There's 2 exclamation points. The title.
Excellent.
Very daring. That's coming out, I want to say, in June.
Okay, perfect. Excellent. And social media handles, anywhere that they can find you for any updates?
Well, Crystal is the social media manager of King Kirby, so it's King Kirby Play on Twitter and Instagram. I should add, you can listen to King Kirby on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, etc. You can also stream it directly on the Broadway Podcast Network website. I am Fred Van Lente, and that's my handle on literally everything.
And Crystal Skillman as well. And also do check out King Kirby Play, Insta and Twitter, or Broadway Podcast Network. We have a beautiful new trailer, comic book trailer that dropped today.
Quite awesome.
So we're really excited about it.
Video,
yes.
All right, excellent. Well, Crystal, Fred, I want to thank you for joining us here. I had a great time chatting about King Kirby and also all things comics and Stan and Jack. Best of luck for the rest of 2021. And I have to say, you guys own March from the sounds of it. So keep going.
Yes.
All right. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Steve. That was awesome.
Thanks for listening, everyone. And once again, a special thank you to Crystal Skillman and Fred Van Lente. We look forward to your comments, so reach out to us on Facebook and at Comix Asylum on Instagram and Twitter.